tonight, but why wouldn't you? Because we have a treat in store for you. We're retracing the tracks of the families, the men, women and children from Cullohill and Borrisoleigh, far-flung places in Australia and all over the world. And here tonight, to take you on that journey, is our own Jamie Groome. Jamie has been with the Society since its foundation nearly 11 years ago. We're delighted to have him here tonight and to have him share his vast research and knowledge on this subject with you. Jamie has also completed, and I'd like to congratulate him, he has completed a Masters from UL in Family History. So without further ado, I'll hand you over now to Jamie Groome.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks, everybody. I will be working from notes. I'm not used to standing in front of a crowd like this. Good evening, everyone, and many thanks for coming. I'd like to welcome you all to this talk. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge some people who helped me get to this point. Father Jared Hennessy, he's here. He allowed me unfettered access to the parish records. Michael Ryan from Malahide, a descendant of one of the families we're going to speak about. I'd like to thank Borrisoleigh Historical Society, Michael Delaney, Tom Lahey, who helped me with some maps, and of course John Connors, who first led me down this winding path. And especially I'd like to thank my wife Siobhan, herself a native of Cullohill, and all my family who helped me all the way with the time and opportunity to do this research. The talk this evening will be in 3 parts. The first part is Ireland, the second part is the passage, and the third part is Australia. On the left you can see evicted by Lady Elizabeth Butler. She was married to Lord Butler, and she, from his memories as a 12-year-old boy of evictions in South Tipperary, she painted that masterpiece. On the right you see swearing allegiance to the Southern Cross. We'll get to that story as we go through. A bit of background, first of all. The genesis of this research was created when a message was sent in a bottle 170 years after the events we're going to talk about tonight. That message was my DNA, and it connected me with a living relative in Australia, and it led to this research into my family and into my parish almost 2 centuries and 7 generations later. Part 1, Ireland. Tonight I'll talk to you about an event that happened in late July 1850. Next year, 2025, it will be 175 years since the mass evictions took place on a parcel of land which encompasses, I'm sure, the 7 townlands, which we will call the Cullohill estate. These comprise from west to east Cullohill, Cullohill, Corrickale, Glenanogue, Mount Canaan and Glenarisk. I will look into at the time of the famine in the locality, the evictions that took place on this estate and in the wider locality, and the subsequent mass chain migration of people from this locale across the seas, in particular to Australia. I will look at their passage to Australia, how it was financed, managed, and how the government-sponsored bounty passage was used to the emigrants' advantage, and also the huge remittance system that was used to benefit those still at home and those that followed out. Oops. Eddie warned me about this. What caused the families to flee their homes, and how did they respond to the catastrophic crisis? We will look at 2 geographic areas, Borrisoleigh and the 7 townlands. Borrisoleigh on the right, situated at green dot. It's not a very good picture of it. In Australia, we will look at the trials and tribulations of 2 families. The Shanahans of Carrigean, who ended up at the red dot northwest of Melbourne around Ballarat, and the Cairns of Cairns' Cross, Glenanogue, who ended up southwest of Sydney at a place called Maringo. So that's the area around Ballarat, Victoria and the 7 townlands in Glenkeen, North Tipperary. Cullohill, Carrigean, Cullohill, Corrickale, Glenanogue, Mount Canaan and Glenarisk up at the top right, the smaller one. In particular, if you look at Ballarat, to the very north, top red dot, is a place called Eganstown, and then at the bottom right hand corner, a place called Ballin. In Eganstown, the migrants followed in the footsteps of a Borrisoleigh man, well, three Borrisoleigh men really, John Egan, Richard Cantwell, and an O'Brien of Cullohill, all of this parish. These are the words of Timothy Shanahan, a pioneer migrant from Carrigaline and Tipperary to Australia in 1851. He gave eyewitness testimony to the evictions that took place on the lands of the Parker brothers the previous July of 1850. They were spoken many years after the fact in the 1880s, still vivid in his memory. He was 86 years of age. Before we go to Australia though, we will look at Borrisoleigh at these times. In the context of Irish modern history, the Great Famine of 1845 to 50 was the greatest of catastrophes, whose consequences dealt Ireland a profound physical and psychological shock, which altered the course of the nation's history. A full quarter of the population vanished, either to the other side of the world or the next. The decades after the famine were the apex point of a mass emigration that has continued ever since and has created a culture of emigration in our psyche. The tide allotment books of 1832 were assembled for the 7 townlands, and it was shown that Cullohill had the most occupiers with 33 and Glenanogue the least with 5. The 7 townlands consisted of 804 acres, 77 households, all of which were in the hands of a Lord Landaff of Thomastown Castle in Golden in County Tipperary. That's Slater's Directory of 1846, and it describes Borrisoleigh. You can see there's nearly 7,500 inhabitants, nearly 1,500 in the village. Today, the village, I think, numbers about 650. This is the Cullohill Cooling Estate. In 1835, title of these lands of Cooling and Cullohill, with their sub-denominations, part of the ancient Thomastown estate, situated in the territory of Ileigh and the barony of Kilnamanagh, passed to the Honourable Lady Eliza Matthew, the only sister and heiress of the Right Honourable Francis Lord Landaff, deceased. In May 1835, 6 months after she received the land, it was purchased by an Anthony Parker Esquire for £9,500. It was a complicated financial affair with monies owed to Landaff's land agent Thomas Lanigan and mortgage lenders in London and Limerick. John and James Parker, his nephews of Brookfield, Kilbarron and Borrisoleigh, took control sometime after this date. They were successful landowners with connections in Castlelock, Ballyvalley, large estates on Lough. In 1832, there were 110 houses on the 7 townlands. By 1848, the 3rd year of the famine, this had only reduced by 5. Both Carrigaline and Cullohill maintained their number of 17 houses and families each between 1832 and 1848. The land system in use here was a middleman system with much division and much subdivision. The Conacre system was coterminous with potato cultivation and subsistence farming. In 1843, the Thurles land agent Nicholas Maher Esquire gave witness to the Devon Commission of middleman practices, the doubling of rent, the practice of subdivision of land, ejectment, and the consolidation of property. Their words: there were 3 brothers who took 200 acres Irish, and now there are 15 families upon it. That is an improvement which is very common in Ireland. Though the land is not improved, they improve the population. Have any instances come to your knowledge of estates having been cleared in order to consolidate small farms into large ones? I believe there has been a good deal of that on the estate of Lord Hawarden and Mr. Carden in Barnan. The Parkers wanted to square the land and remove the smallholders and the cottiers. It was a simple matter of economics. Their investment was not returning a sufficient dividend. At this time, land hunger prevailed and every piece was contested. Tipperary had already a high level of violence and crime, and the policy of ejectment and consolidation of land was a contributory factor to this increase in the agrarian criminality. This already volatile situation was about to be accosted by the single most influential cataclysmic event in modern Irish history: the arrival of the blight, which infested and decimated the potato fields in that late July of 1845. In April and May 1846, the meetings of the Poor Relief Fund, jointly chaired by the Church of Ireland rector Alexander Hoops and Reverend William Morris, declared that a quarter of all inhabitants in the parish were in a state of extreme destitution. And this collection was organised with many local landowners subscribing to the fund. I'm not sure if you can make out the top, but the Honourable Mrs. Otway Cave subscribed £30, William Beamish £15, John and James Parker, Miss Margaret Cook, and Reverend William Morris, parish priest, were amongst the 10 donations. The curates donated £3 each, the Sub-Inspector of Police, John Malone, £2, and right at the very bottom, from the bottom, is Tady Shanahan, who donated 2 shillings and 6 pence. You can see the names there and the townlands, a lot of people that you'll recognise and a lot of names that you'll recognise. The police were very worried about violence, as Sub-Inspector Malone in his report to Dublin Castle reported in middle of March 1846. Many people in my district are now opening their pits, the greater part of which are rotten. I further beg to remark that the labouring class in this town are in a most destitute state. I fear much that if they don't get immediate employment, they will take provisions by force. In May 1847, a correspondent reported in the Freeman's Journal, "Much alarm prevails among the poor. Should government persist in this monstrous attempt to starve a peaceful, suffering people, on their heads will be the destruction of property throughout the country." In September, a Borrisoleigh correspondent of the Tipperary Vindicator reported of hundreds of the sick and impotent, all wretched objects of misery, crowd our streets, seeking relief without any hope of success. In November that year, a poor, inoffensive widow named Kearns was barbarously murdered in a field near Borrisoleigh. The situation was increasingly hopeless, as once comfortable families watched their labouring neighbours suffer, starve and separate. The landless labouring poor were the first to starve and suffer, as they depended altogether on wages for subsistence. The cold realisation of the impending doom that was facing the population in Borrisoleigh around the next failed potato harvest, or non-payment of rent, was all too evident. James Fintan Lawler, the famous revolutionary and Young Islander, wrote to the Nation newspaper from Abbeyleix on the 11th of January 1847. The smallest landholders of this class were labourers also, labourers with assurance against positive starvation. Each man had at least a foothold of existence. Their country had hope for them. But now this hope was evaporating, and according to Lawler, the policy and purpose of the London Parliament was the conversion of the inferior classes of Irish landholders into independent labourers, and the authorities' belief that the small occupier is a man who ought not to be existing. Lawler's radical ideas of peasant rebellion and proprietorship found much support in the Borrisoleigh area, with Father John Kenyon in Templederry and P.B. Ryan, a brewer in Borrisoleigh, ardent supporters. In fact, Lawler was arrested here in Borrisoleigh on the 28th of July 1848, the eve of the failed rebellion at Ballingarry. In Borrisoleigh also, some blacksmiths were arrested for pipe making and committed for trial. Later, some would carry this skill of pipe making to the goldfields of Australia. The parish in 1841 census reported nearly 7,500 people. That was a rise of 13.5% on the previous decade in 1831. However, between 1841 and 1851, the population of Tipperary fell by a full 25%, or nearly 111,000 people. The number of four-class houses, the bottom level, fell by 64% in the same area and period, instead of an increase in national population to a probable number of over 9 million. As you can see from the 7 townlands, these tables, the population was nearly halved in that 10-year period. Carrigain, a population of 138 in 1841, fell by 63, over 45% to 75, an average of nearly 46%. The population was halved, in essence. Similarly, the number of inhabited houses decreased on average by over 40%. In Cullohill, it was nearer 60%. On Saturday, the 15th of January 1848, Judith Doheney, a former tenant at Cullohill of the Parker brothers, expired in the Nina jail while serving a 6-month sentence after having been found guilty of re-entering her former house for shelter after wandering about in much want without any shelter. Land clearance and ejectment was rife throughout the vicinity. Tipperary had the unwanted distinction of having the highest number of evictions in the country, with well over 3,000 ejectments in 3 years from 1847 to 1849. By 1850, Tipperary accounted for 16% of the national total of ejectments. In that year, Tipperary also returned the highest RIC police numbers in the country. In the adjoining townland of Knockkelly in August 1846, a Thomas Conway, 70 years of age, and his family were ejected from their holdings, despite being paid up in rent, as the local middleman, a prominent Catholic Captain Andrew de Bourgh, demanded a high rent. The sub-sheriff's deputy, Mr. Gasson, and Sergeant Sholes, both local men with a party of police, entered the wretched cabin and put out a few articles of furniture, turf, etc., before an excited people who had assembled. 6 tenant families were evicted from the lands of O'Driscoll, barrister at law, across the river in the immediately adjacent townland of Ballarat in September 1849. 10 adults and 28 children were put out of their homes by the Sub-Inspector Malone and a party of police. In early 1849, the Tipperary Vindicator gave an account of the eviction of 6 families, 27 persons, at Upper Garngrain and Borrisoleigh. The same journal stated that many houses had been levelled in the vicinity and that 60 ejectments had been served on the lands of Palace, Borrisoleigh. These incidents were reported as far afield as Melbourne in their daily news. Now we look at the townland of Carrigain in 1848. The Shanahan-Canaan family of Carrigain in the Borrisoleigh rate book of October 1847 in the townland of Carrigain, John and Teddy Shanahan, brothers, jointly paid rents on 25 statute acres. In the primary valuation taken the following February, their holdings are listed at 4 and 5. I'm not sure if you can make that out. They had 3 houses, offices, and land to a total value of £14.05. Carrigain comprised 17 households. Mary Shanahan and Catherine Shanahan, believed to be sisters of John and Teddy, also lived in the cluster of houses at Carrigain. Catherine had married a William Kennedy there on the 1st of May 1836. This is my own map. At the bottom right hand corner you can see Cullohill Cross. The Kearns family are just above that on the right. If you follow up the grey road to your left, the main Nina road is running through. The grey road to your left is the corner at Burke's Forge. The old road continued all the way up past the castle, to first the Kennedys and then the Shanahans of Carrigain. The road continued all the way around the bog to rejoin the main road at, I think it's Slattery's now, today. In the bottom left you can see the police barracks at Knockkelly. Late in the lean month of Cabbage July, on Friday the 26th of July 1850, before the digging of the new crop and at the remnants of the previous season's harvest, agents of government, bailiffs, crowbar men, police, army, law, land agents gathered at Ross Cottage at Cullohill, just near, you can see Ross Cottage at the bottom, at Kearns' Cross. to clear the surrounding 7 townlands of Cullohill, Carrigain, Cullohill, Mount Kinane, Corricade, Glenanog and Glenarisk. 20 crowbar men from neighbouring parishes and levellers, supported by Sub-Inspector Malone and 40 police, removed 105 families from their homes, knocking, tumbling and burning as they went. The duty was carried out legally on behalf of landlords John and James Parker to clear the tenantry permanently and destroy their homes and holdings as if they had never existed. The Parkers' decision to eject all tenantry, whether desirous to consolidate and modernise their holdings into larger, more productive farms, or unburden themselves of impoverished tenants unable to pay rent, was the final straw for many of the families subsisting and barely surviving on their holdings. The proliferation of ejectment and clearance in the vicinity was widespread. The previous May 1849 in Tumivara, 576 persons had been ejected. In August 49, 78 families near Nina, 40 families at Killiscully removed from the land. The Nina Guardian reported on this justifiable and necessary act, where large tracts of land with miserable mud cabins may now be seen cultivated and properly tilled instead of being waste and useless. The correspondent from Maurice Lenhan's Limerick Reporter reported, on the progress of depopulation, 470 souls cast on the world. The tone of the writing here was much more considerate and sympathetic. A scene so utterly appalling has been seldom witnessed. The misery and desolation may be imagined, but the wailing, the shrieks of the widows and orphans cannot be described. At the end of his piece, however, the writer does conciliate to the repossessors. Some of those victims were possessors of promising crops, but farms should be enlarged. Teddy Shanahan's account to the Ballarat Courier in the 1880s. In Corrigain, where I lived, 17 houses were burnt in one day by way of eviction. This number of 17 houses tallies exactly with the number of houses occupied in the 1848 Griffiths evaluation. Teddy's next quote is quite revealing. I had once made up my mind to be under Parker, our landlord, no longer, and I came out here. Here, he decided, Australia, for the benefit and survival of his family, he must leave this land. Whether he had fully determined for Australia or not is not evident. He was in the position of a comfortable gentleman farmer. Tipperary had the unenviable position of the land clearance, having had the highest number of families in houses level. In September 1849, Tipperary 69 was part of a concerned group. 40,000 people were removed, calling for the public demonstration and action houses in the cause of tenant right. 2,700 houses level. The Catholic clergy of this time were drawn from the order of this number, according to the successful tenant farmers that had emerged from the peasant rural society. And unbelievably, they were drawn into political and agrarian male families, as were their kinsmen, and ultimately they would follow their Borrisoleigh was situated in the poor law union of Thurles, but was also in this most catastrophic of situations. There has always been opportunities from the workhouse. This opportunity of property consolidation by 1851, serious overcrowding acts of the workhouse by the landowner had led to auxiliary extra workhouses being engaged. The Irish were given 1851 preferential inheritance. 8,312 English way of primogeniture at these locations. These many scholars to believe Nina and Thurles had over 3,000 inmates each, hastened by the laissez-faire policy. This overcrowding led to huge pressure for the rural population. Famine pandemics, creation of a landless mobile labour class ran fed into the expansionist empirical. In 1849, Thurles had the highest number of cholera cases in the country. We had an ideological out in 89 and saw the Great Famine with over 50% mortality bring about immediate. Nina suffered a mortality rate of 60%, clearing the land of the poor, developing commercial. On entrance to the poorhouse, and families were split up. Perhaps an additional cause that this social engineering would have horrific consequences. In 1 week, beginning the 14th of April, 1849, 150 Ireland was difficult. 54 of them were children, especially if you were poor. On the 27th of April, middle class small farmers, 2 incidents of bourgeois of Irish. Firstly, a man named Ryan died from home country outside Knockkelly Barracks at the side of the evening of the 26th of July 1850 at the crossroads of Cullohill. Despite being offered a ticket by the former workhouse smouldering, he refused, saying he would find dying and each souls in the world outside. Some families were. The second incident, the burning of a small, unoccupied house at Cullohill, some property of the workhouse.
The supposed cause of the United States Canada re-entering many they leave the work never to return to the far side. The Freeman's Journal reported of the Cullohill evictions and the agents of government moving step by step with the pestilence, whose contributions to the wayside and the workhouse were on a liberal scale. That was part one. British law prevailed over the lamentation and the ruin of 470 unarmed and unresisting. The second part is the passage, the weak and the strong. To give some context of when all this happened, as I said earlier, club for Turner 75 years ago. Irish only 85 years ago in 1938 that the last they will be cured very quickly, then stored away in the colony to South Australia, traversing the southern oceans to Europe. In May 1848, called William Morris and Parish Priest Borrisoleigh's experience in the Bulletin de la Dying Breaths of this Global Congratulatory Address, assuring the board there is a few remaining last of the foremost approval of the Irish priests, plying the route from southern Australia ports to Europe. However, as that summer progressed, his passage neighbour John's 91 days, well below the average. Their ardour and the fastest strategy was cooled by the Catholic. The cargo wheat, no doubt, contained grain, grown by the descendants of Irish farmers 26 to 85 years ago, and not before that, in 1850. At a two-storey stone-slated house in the 1850s, Irish families had migrated from their towns, fleeing the turmoil and terror of the previous decade, seeking refuge, respite, and hopeful of a better life in the terra nullius of Australia. It was a huge undertaking, usually a 4-month journey aboard a 4-masted bark, like what Newby had shipped aboard in 1938. One of those families, James Shanahan and his wife, Anne Berkery, and 3 young children, sailed aboard the Appling on the 16th of July 1854. Also aboard was his younger brother Pat and a 7-year-old relative, Michael Shanahan. All disembarked on the 7th of November 1854 on their own account to join their brother at the Richmond Survey. They were part of a chain migration that had commenced with the departure of his older brother Timothy, and his wife Biddy Canaan, and their 3 children, who had emigrated from Plymouth aboard the James T. Ford on Christmas Eve 1850, arriving at Port Phillip, Victoria on the 1st of May 1851. Also on board were 19-year-old James and 22-year-old Bridget Shanahan, a nephew and niece, children of his brother John back at Carrageen. Thady had attended his nephew John's baptism on the 22nd of May 1832. 6 months after their eviction, Thady Shanahan and extended family were on board ship. They did not leave with much, but what they had, mostly what all their other emigrating brethren possessed, what Donald Atkinson described as an immense hunger for land and the skill and ingenuity in its acquisition on the part of Irish people of all classes and all religions. In every new world, land hunger gnaws at the gut of almost all Irish immigrants, and protection of land, once acquired, is a drive as deep as any, except the most basic biological motives. Ireland has had an intermittent relationship with population. Today it rises steadily, contrary to trends in other modern European and Western societies. At the beginning of the 19th century, it also grew at unprecedented rates until the 1840s and the Great Hunger and the beginning of a mass migration of our people across the globe. After which, I think this is broken, Eddie. Batteries, maybe. Yeah. The exodus of people between 1845 and 1855 was unprecedented in modern times. Almost 2.1 million people were removed from their homeland. Of these, over 1 million left under extreme duress during the famine years proper. This was not a voluntary migration, but rather a mass deluge of humanity, mainly across the Irish Sea to Liverpool and across the Atlantic to North America. Depopulation in Ireland was almost exclusively a rural phenomenon, and in this chapter the practicalities and experiences of people on the move across the globe has been discussed. The movement of country people was not new to the inhabitants of Borrisoleigh. Migration and emigration was common among the farming classes. Joel Moker estimated at least 1.5 million people had left Ireland between 1815 and 1845. As Atkinson stated, the famine was not the cause of the Irish diaspora. What the famine did was confirm and accelerate the Irish predisposition to leave the homeland. The population density in 1841 of the parish of Glenkeen was over 50 persons per 100 acres, rising to well over 50 in the village. In his memoir, Sir William Francis Butler of South Tipperary recalled the country about where we lived was swarming with people. Along the road were cabins, little thatched mud cottages at every 100 paces. In folk memories collected in Borrisoleigh in the 1930s, local people remembered that the people tell stories about the famine times of 1847. Before that time, this district was very much populated. There had been about 300 had to leave this district, and one witness born in 1871 recalled, "The district was thickly populated before the famine. The people died with hunger and the rest went to Australia. People still point out sites of houses that were occupied during the famine and are now in ruins. There is one on the site on the land of Dennis Young, Knockahorna. It was occupied until the famine by a man called Fitzpatrick. During the famine, he sold his animals, left his house and land, and went away to Australia." Between the 1st of May 1851 and 1857, nearly 21% of Tipperary's population emigrated, the highest rate in the country. Although landlord-funded immigration was a scheme approved and encouraged at the highest levels, it did not appear to be available to the tenants of the parkers. Some Borrisoleigh girls had travelled on the workhouse orphan scheme. A Bridget Burke and Mary Gleeson, both 18, a Bridget O'Dwyer and Mary Kennedy, both 15, from Borrisoleigh, travelled aboard the Lady Peel in 1849 to Sydney. The organiser of this, Earl Grey, was well informed and aware of the Irish propensity for chain migratory culture, and along with Lord Monteagle and Limerick, they sought to prime the pump by inducing landlords and workhouses to facilitate immigration. For Grey, this also helped to solve the political opposition he received in London associated with fully funding migration of the undesirable Irish to the crown lands of the empire. The newspapers of the day carried enticing advertisements for the passage. They marketed themselves well in the scramble for business. The Sir Edmund Head, with Commander Thomas Ferran, promised to carry an experienced surgeon in a new ship, a most desirable conveyance. The Bernicia, under Harford, built expressly for the passenger trade and classed A1, a fine vessel with spacious accommodation to secure the comfort and convenience of passengers. Passage money £21. Both ships were available through agents on Henry Street, Limerick, the Ryan brothers. The Nina Guardian reported of the tide of immigration increasing daily. Was there an inclination amongst the people to emigrate? In his evidence before a select committee on colonisation, the very Reverend Theobald Matthew, the father of temperance, himself born on the land of estate, described it thus: "The whole of the poor population seems to be in motion, anxious to go. The greater part of them have relatives on the other side." His viewpoint on the condition of emigrants and remittances: "They describe it as one of comparative comfort, much better than it was at home. They will soon send them money to come out. I have received letters containing some £50, some £20, and £5 the least." He described the Australian immigration from Cork as well managed under a superintendence of a Mr. Besnard. John Egan was a pioneer migrant, a Borrisoleigh native. He had arrived in Melbourne travelling with two cousins, a Woodlock and an O'Brien, on New Year's Eve 1840. He went on to lease a pastoral run, one of the first Catholics to do so, of 16,000 acres, and established a homestead with his brother-in-laws Philip Cantwell and John Larkin at Coronella in 1848. He later found gold on lands close by, with assistance from Patrick and Richard Cantwell, and this led to the establishment of Eganstown, a small town less than 40 kilometres northeast of Ballarat. It was in this area between North Melbourne, Ballarat, Ballin and Bacchus Marsh that many Borrisoleigh natives would eventually lay down roots to form a new Irish-Australian community. It is known that Egan wrote to Larkin and Cantwell to invite them to help him establish a pastoral lease and squat on government lands. A squatter has been used to describe an illegal occupier of Crown grazing land beyond the prescribed limits of settlement. But in this instance, a squatter is one who occupied Crown lands under a lease or licence. John Egan was very successful and engaged in pastoralism and gold mining extensively in the area, with interests in much property. He discovered gold in Kids Gully, Spring Creek, also known as the Jim Crow diggings. He was partnered by his son Michael Egan and the John Lahey from Borrisoleigh. Philip Cantwell leased a run of 2,000 acres 4 miles southwest of Ballin, when Richard Patrick and Thomas Cantwell took it over in 1861. Richard then leased 13,000 acres at Glen Lyon, 8 miles north of Ballin, until 1870. The successes of Egan, Cantwell and others had no doubt reached their neighbours and family back in Borris. These pioneers had struck double gold, leaving Ireland from small farms under 10 acres to holding vast acreages in the hundreds and thousands. They had gold deposits buried beneath the soil instead of rotten potatoes. In the 16 years between 1853 and 1870, over 162,000 free Irish immigrants entered Australia. Successive colonial governments, desperate to fuel a growing economy with a labour force, offered subsidised assisted immigration to the home countries. In the period of 6 years between 1853 and 1859, 70% of all Irish arriving in Australia were assisted. In 1850 alone, over 3,000 Irish assisted migrants made up 67% of the total immigrant population to Australia. Tipperary made up over 30% of all government-assisted Irish immigrants to Victoria in that year. In 1843, the average cost to the colonial government was at £18 and 9 shillings. By 1849, this cost had reduced to £13. The cost was prohibitive for many Irish. Therefore, many required state assistance or sponsorship by private bounty contractors. The Irish showed an eagerness to participate and an ability to circumvent controls or quotas regarding immigration policies to ensure their over-representation amongst Australia's newest arrivals. All of Teddy's brothers and families would follow his pioneering lead, except his older brother John, who it is believed had died during the famine at Carrigaline. However, after her husband's death, his widow, Margaret Peggy Ryan, and 4 children emigrated aboard the Emma Eugenia from Plymouth on the 23rd of March 1852. Thomas Shanahan, 34, and wife Mary Burke, 32, and sons Patrick and John and James had already emigrated aboard the Joshua as free immigrants in 1851. Michael Shanahan and Kitty Maher and family left Liverpool aboard the Bournemouth on the 26th of May 1852. They had lost one child during the famine, and Catherine or Kitty Maher and her daughter Anne had died during this passage. Aboard this ship, the Bournemouth, 84 people died, almost 10% of those aboard. 76 of those were under 7 years of age. 28-year-old Kitty had died from consumption, and her youngest daughter Anne had died from marasmus. 27 people died from diarrhoea, 26 from measles, 11 from scarlatina, 9 from marasmus, 6 from respiratory diseases, and the remainder from various causes, including one lost overboard. Michael Shanahan arrived with his daughters Bridget and Margaret, twins 13, and son James 4. He had been engaged for employment by an Edward McCormack at Point Henry. The Bournemouth had sailed with 837 migrants crowded aboard, a hellish voyage aboard a workhouse on the waves, and not typical of most Australian emigrant ships. Aboard the James T. Ford Teddy's ship, just 9 people died, regrettably including his 3-year-old daughter Judith from measles. In the 4 years after the evictions, The remaining Shanahan families had all left Borrisoleigh. 3 families, John and Peggy's, and Teddy's and James from Carrigean, and 3 families, Michael, Thomas and Patrick from Cullohill. 6 Shanahan families had left and travelled via Dublin, Limerick or Cork to embark at Liverpool or Plymouth on a voyage that could last over 100 days. On the far side of the Nina Road, less than a mile from Carrigean at Glenanog, Patrick Kearns had been born on the 7th of February 1844 to Philip Kearns of Glenanog and Catherine Harty of Cullohill, who had been married in February 1838. Between that time and 1846, Catherine had given birth to 4 children, Michael, Philip, Patrick and Catherine. All the Kearns brothers, Philip, Conor and James, married well into local farming families, the Hartys, the Shays and the Kellys. In 1850, Philip Kearns, 39 years of age, and Catherine Harty, 32, departed aboard the Garland, with Michael 14, Philip 11, Patrick 9. It is unknown the fate of the youngest child, Catherine, as she no longer appeared in any records. Perhaps as an infant in the worst year of the famine, she had succumbed. The rest of the family arrived on 15th of March 1851 to stay with a cousin, Michael Martin, at Maitland. They had paid £10 themselves toward the cost of their emigration. They had departed Plymouth, England on the 30th of November 1850, just 4 months after the evictions, in company with 300 immigrants and 52 crew. Fever and whooping cough had claimed the lives of 9 children and 5 adults on this voyage. On arrival, there were still children on board sick with whooping cough, so the ship was put into quarantine. Another child died of typhus during the quarantine of 10 days. After quarantine, it was reported that there were available for hire 37 married and 75 unmarried agricultural labourers and 40 unmarried women. The children's deaths aboard the Garland, 3%, were below the average loss rate recorded at 5.5% of child immigrants that embarked to Australia. The average loss for the same period across all immigrants to Australian ports was less than 2%. The decimation aboard and despair felt by Thomas Shanahan and his family aboard this ship was comparable to the worst times of the Great Hunger. As the years progressed and the Immigration Commission installed better and safer procedures for travelling immigrants to the colonies, the deaths on board dramatically decreased. With healthier dietary regimes for younger children, improved sanitary and cooking facilities, the immigrants' lot on board, while still dangerous, was an acceptable risk for prospective immigrants to take. In the spring of 1851, Thady Shanahan and Philip Kearns, neighbours at home in Ireland, had arrived separately to Port Phillip district for Thady and New South Wales for Philip. They were arriving in strange lands, but not to strange people. Both families were arriving to friends or family. They had travelled communally, in family units, safety in numbers. The Irish rarely travelled alone, rather in kin groups or with fellow parishioners. More than 9 out of 10 immigrants travelled in groupings. Their learned methods of survival and continuance, despite repeated crises throughout the years, were assisted by their traditions, kinship, comradeship and mehel. This support system that had once extended across their winter, across the fields and townlands of Borrisoleigh, now reached across the oceans. Through remittances, letters home, advice, ingenuity and sponsorship, the flow of people from Borrisoleigh would abide. By mid-century, the Irish would make up over 1/5 of the Australian population, by far the only significant ethnic group for the next 100 years. Part 3, Australia. These are the Port Phillip heads, the first sight of land for an emigrant when they're entering Geelong or Melbourne. Letters home from Borrisoleigh migrants of the time are unattainable, but fortunately scholar David Fitzpatrick, his work on called The Oceans of Consolation, provides contemporary context and personal accounts from Irish rural immigrants to their family at home. The Normile letters to West Clare vividly describe the opportunities available in Australia, the wages, the availability of land, and the possibility of advancement and even the loneliness. Michael Normile and his sister Bridget's letters home to their father in Clare, from the vicinity of Maitland in the Hunter Valley, where the Kearns first started, can provide some evidence for what the Kearns family may have experienced. That's a quote from a letter. 2 crops of potatoes, 4 crops of hay. These letters home were more influential than any government pamphlets. Honest and trustworthy news, advice and offers of financial help and invitations to friends and family were very difficult to refuse. In another letter he says, "I wish to God you came to this country when you was young and able to work," to his father. In a letter dated 3rd of August 1856, Michael Normile explains of his failed efforts to bring a sister free passage from New York to Sydney, and then tells of his wife is about paying her brother's passage to this colony. The Irish newspapers carried good news stories of the southern colonies. The Nina Guardian published a much detailed letter from an Andrew McWilliams, formerly Nina and now Geelong. The Australian immigration process, from the initial securing of passage to the sea voyage and on to the arrival, was a somewhat paternalistic endeavour. The government policies and safeguards ensured the immigrants' experience was easier than, say, the transatlantic passage. For this reason, the immigrant was much more likely to encourage and organise further chain migration of their kin and neighbour groupings. The bureaucratic processes of the immigration system were continually improving, and whilst at first arduous and intimidating, the Irish soon became well versed in their manipulation and quickly overcame any impediments to travel. The organisation of labour and accommodation on arrival was documented and mostly assured. Some immigrants would remain in the depot until suitable arrangements had been engaged. This government administration ensured a rapid integration of the newly arrived, and may also have contributed to a dispersal across the rural-urban divide, with many Irish choosing rural settlement over the American model of urban dwelling in the cities, where the Irish clung together and again sought safety in numbers. The Australian model, avoiding the creation of city slums, permitted a better start to the immigrant and allowed a faster adjustment and increased opportunity to the newcomers. Now we'll speak a bit about the Kearns of Glenanogue and New South Wales. I just picked 2 families to study. Philip Kearns, his wife Catherine Harty and 3 sons, Michael, Philip and Patrick, after first going to Michael Martin at Maitland in New South Wales, established themselves working on the vast MacArthur estate at Camden Park near Campbelltown. A daughter, Margaret, was born here in 1852, and it was here that the Kearns educated themselves in the ways of Australian agriculture and animal husbandry, especially sheep and horses, before proceeding in 1861 to take up their own selection at Calabash Station near Moringo in New South Wales. For 10 years after his arrival, Philip had gathered financial capital, knowledge and family around him to assist him in his quest to take up farming again and a pastoral lease for his own family. However, whilst on the road to Moringo with relatives and other families to take up land, he passed away from an attack of appendicitis, a long way from any medical help. He was buried at the side of the road near Maryland, New South Wales. He had left this new world 10 years after leaving the old world in Ireland. His widow, Catherine Harty, and her sons and daughter now faced another huge crisis. It was now 1862, and the Kearns family were headed for the countryside, the bush, to create a homestead, a legacy for future generations. They were fulfilling what Patrick O'Farrell called a veritable obsession with the acquisition of land and livestock. Having been starved and evicted in Ireland, they now sought to reassure themselves of their survival and the proliferation of their kinfolk. They would make sure that they and theirs would never suffer the ignominy of hunger, starvation and ejectment ever again. Philip Kearns had helped to bring relatives to this new country. He paid £4 towards the passage of his nephew Michael Kearns, son of James Kearns and Annie Kelly of Glenanogue, 19 years old. He arrived on the ship Wellington in 1859 to his uncle and godfather, Philip at Campbelltown. He also paid £4 each for the passage of Philip and John Harty of Cullohill, 28 years and 24 years respectively, nephews of his wife Catherine. After his tragic death, his eldest son, Michael, continued this family duty and commitment to the preservation and advancement of kith and kin. Michael paid £24 for the passage aboard the Abyssinian of James Kearns, Catherine Kearns and a Richard Egan. It seems James, 38 years, declined the passage and instead was refunded £8 to be paid in Ireland. Richard and Catherine arrived in Sydney on the 29th of May 1862. Also aboard that ship were Michael and Ellen Carey, cousins from Templemore, sponsored £8 and £5 by Michael Kearns, and also aboard were a Philip and Mary Kennedy of Borrisoleigh, a son and mother. Indeed, Irish women were one of the most important ingredients in this transoceanic endeavour. In the latter part of the 19th century, Irish women made up over half of all immigrants. It was the women who understood and used the systems to their advantage the best. While Irish men accounted for about half of the assisted passages, close to 90% of Irish women were assisted. They kept the system of chain migration going, arranging passages and promises of employment and sending monies to bring brothers and sisters and cousins and neighbours. It was by their obstinate methods and dogged devotion to family that the success and proliferation of Irish family systems, traditions, culture and beliefs were assured into the following generations. The Kearns family may have taken much inspiration from contemporary successful Irish pastoralists and landowners such as John Hurley from Limerick and Ned Ryan from Clonalty. Both were former convicts who held thousands of acres. Hurley operated hotels and inns and a coach service from Sydney. He also had 50,000 acres at the Cootamundra Run on the road from Campbelltown to Borrisoleigh. His horse breeding was well regarded across the colony. Ned Ryan established at Geelong in the Boorawa region in southwest New South Wales. In the 1850s, his little kingdom, he constructed a tower house reminiscent of the tower house at Dot Tipperary, adjacent to his homestead. This statement in stone was like a beacon that attracted much Irish settlement to the region and was perhaps even a challenge to the colonial English concepts of land ownership. Malcolm Campbell described this area around Boorawa as a resurrected Gaelic kingdom. Ryan had surrounded himself with family and relatives and encouraged other kinfolk to take up leases in the area. However, John Dunmore Lang, a popular and prominent Scottish-born Presbyterian clergyman, much opposed to Irish Catholic immigration, held the sectarian viewpoint that New South Wales was a British colony and should not be treated as an Irish one, and found that the Boorawa region to be the most thoroughly Roman Catholic district in New South Wales, a veritable slice of County Tipperary. After the death of her husband, Catherine Kearns took up the selection with her family at Calabash near Maringo. She is described by her great-granddaughter, Maya Ronan, as a formidable woman, a Tartar, a small, swift woman with intense dark eyes and a lashing tongue, directed against absentee English landlords, responsible for the sufferings of the Irish during the potato famines. She instilled in all of her grandchildren a hatred of injustice, and she left Ireland with a group of families who banded together to find a new life in Australia. That's the church in Maringo. Can you see that? That the Kearns helped to build. Philip Kearns and Catherine Harty's son Patrick arrived in the Garland in 1850 as a 6-year-old boy. He went on to become a very successful and wealthy grazier and gathered many properties in the region. According to his granddaughter, he was tireless in his quest for land and livestock, driven surely by the need to provide. This was often done by dummying and other improper land acquisition practices. He lived at Templemore Station on the Maringo Flats. from 1865 until 1912. He called it Templemore Station because that's the station he left from as a 6-year-old boy. He prospered in wool growing and fat stock raising. He moved to Carrington Road, Waverley, in Sydney in 1912, where he lived until his death in 1931. He married a Mary Lenan in 1871 and they were married for 60 years. The Lenan family had accompanied the Cairns across on their trek in 1861 over the Blue Mountains to take up the land at Maringo. They had 13 children, of whom 11 survived, 7 sons and 4 daughters. All his sons became successful graziers on the land, growing wool and wheat, and held farms at Mudgee, Boorawa and Maringo. His daughters married a solicitor, a farmer and a merchant. Patrick was survived by his wife Mary, 7 children, 32 grandchildren, and is buried near the Irish Martyrs Memorial for those who cared and suffered for Ireland in 1798 in Waverley Cemetery, Sydney. It's right on the coast between Bondi and Mother Beach. He had remained a devout Catholic throughout his life and became a tertiary of St. Francis. His solemn requiem mass was sung by the Franciscans and well attended by over 17 priests. His religion had not left him in his journey from Glenanogue to Waverley, and nor had his political interests. In 1923, Father Michael O'Flanagan and J.J. Kelly, 2 prominent Republican envoys, on a tour of the USA and Australia to inform and seek support from the public for their cause, were arrested during a meeting at his house. In 1923, an Irish flag was thrown across the hedge before Mr. Cairns' house. The 2 were sent for trial for sedition and afterwards deported, after a prominent sectarian backlash against their presence in New South Wales. In a letter from Patrick's daughter Anastasia to cousins and Thurles that also contained a £5 gift for Easter, she mentions the great excitement at the time when the Irish envoys were arrested at my father's house. Patrick Cairns had left Glenanogue, aged 6, in 1850, after his family's eviction from their humble cottage. Despite of, or maybe because of, their harsh, humble beginning in life, they succeeded. They had improvised, adapted, and overcome all crises that came their way, to become a founding people, and as described in his obituary, one of the great pioneers who laid the foundation of the Southwest, and always a great Irish Australian. He had built fine farms and homes at Templemore and at Kildare, where his family grew and prospered, as it continues to do today. The Shanahans of Carrigean and Victoria. On arrival in Port Phillip in 1851, Thady Shanahan and Mary Canan and their family stayed at the depot for just 4 days, while his nephew and niece John and Bridget left immediately to join their aunt at Geelong, signed for by a Mr. and Mrs. Cantwell of Melbourne. Several Cantwell families lived in Borrisoleigh. The Canans and Shanahans had been neighbours at Rusheen in Borrisoleigh for many years. Shortly after their arrival, gold was discovered at Ballarat, 45 miles north of Geelong and 75 miles west of Melbourne. This was the first major gold field of any extent in Victoria and was made known on the 8th of September 1851, 4 months after Thady's arrival. The rush to the area was huge, with the press declaring Geelong staring gold mad. The number of gold digging licences taken out, each costing 30 shillings a month, increased fourfold in 2 months. Thady Shanahan arrived at Molinyon in 1851, just after the discovery of gold, James Esmond. Each of his party took 8 pounds of gold back to Geelong, where his family waited. They spent Christmas there and afterwards returned to Ballarat in a family party of 17 people, with wives and children accompanying the men. The story of the Eureka Rebellion and the gold miners' revolt against unfair taxes and the rigid bureaucracy imposed by the British administration is an essential ingredient in the settler history of Australia. The fire of Australian democracy may have been first sparked here, with many politicians and commentators having their say either way about the importance of Eureka in Australian history. In an interview with the Ballarat Courier in his 86th year, Thady recalled the lead up to the rebellion. The diggers were wearied out of our lives by the troopers, tormented everywhere. Our party on the diggings must have paid £500 in licence fees. Tensions were very high before the British troops stormed the stockade on Sunday morning, the 3rd of December 1854. Thady and Mary had a store in the stockade, in whose store the dream of anti-British freedom was sketched out by the red-hot insurgents. They were intimately involved in the goings-on and participated willingly in the organisation of defence and resistance. It was reported that indeed the Declaration of Independence was drawn up beneath their canvas roof. Thady and Mary both gave vivid descriptions of the rising and the futile defence of the stockade by the pikemen against the well-trained and marshalled British troops. This included the attempted burning of their store and 2 neighbouring stores held by 2 other Borrisoleigh men, a Matthew Ryan and a Patrick Canal. Peter Lawler, the youngest brother of James Fintan Lawler, the revolutionary and young islander arrested in Borrisoleigh, was chosen by the diggers in the stockade as their commander-in-chief. On 30th of November 1854, he led the miners at a mass meeting to swear an oath beneath the Southern Cross flag. We swear by the Southern Cross to stand truly by each other and fight to defend our rights and our liberties. However, after the bloody defeat, Lawler's rescue from capture and subsequent escape from authorities on Father Smith's horse, alongside the wanton slaughter and the dead bodies here and there, I counted 22 dead, the pikemen suffered most, was vividly recalled by Mary with much emotion. The blacksmith who had forged the pikes used that day was killed by Lieutenant Richards of the 40th Regiment. After his recuperation, Lawler went on to represent in Victorian Parliament until his death in 1889. In March 1854, Thady and Mary's son, 9-year-old James, was listed as a pupil at the St. Aloysius School, which was associated with the Catholic Church in Ballarat. Thady was an original trustee. The head teacher of this school was a Mrs. Harrington, née Burke of Ross Cottage, Borrisoleigh, where the evictors had gathered that July morning in 1850. It was here in the same church in 1856 that his niece Bridget, daughter of John and Peggy at Carrageen, married John Bowen, son of John Bowen and Ellen Fogarty's former neighbours at Carrageen. After some years as storekeepers in Ballarat, Thady and Mary took up land nearby at Warrenheap and lived out the remaining days surrounded by family. At a reunion for the Eureka Stockaders in 1884, Thady remarked, "Sure, it was elegant to be there, was it not?" The paper also reported that Thady, who has not been favoured by fortune, now at the age of 82, is potato digging at Warrenheap. Thady died on the 3rd of November 1888 and Mary 3 years later. Both are buried together in the Ballarat Old Cemetery. By late 1854, Thady's 3 brothers, James, Michael and Tom, and families, were operating east of Melbourne at the Richmond Survey, clearing land and tree felling, working for a Kennedy timber getting at Boorawa, driving carts and as storekeepers. Michael, whose wife and child, Catherine Maher and Anne, had died aboard the Borrisoleigh, remarried a Margaret Hackett in July 1854. Margaret was a Borrisoleigh native of Coolderry, and she had come out on the Omega. The Shanahan families would go on to prosper near and far, hotel keeping in the Northern Territory, farming and mining in Queensland and Papua New Guinea. They integrated quickly into the colonial melting pot. They became, like the Kearns family, the epitome of Australia. Hard-working, rugged, simple, honest folk building new lives, toiling under a blue sky, forging a new nation, turning a colonial outpost of empire into a modern society of equals through their blood, sweat and tears. The Shanahan and Kearns family had faced many trials, overcoming famine, their eviction as tenants from the land of the Parkers in Tipperary, to becoming homesteaders and landowners on the vast expanses of New South Wales and Victoria. The Irish had not only surrounded themselves with family, but also their co-religionists, clergy and political leaders. The role of the Roman Catholic Church cannot be underestimated. The Church was ever present in the lives of many Irish Australian families. According to O'Farrell, a dominant clerical leadership was provided by a Catholic Church, which played a pragmatic, sensible role in leading the people towards a successful, supportive role in the colonial world. In Victoria in 1861, in the electoral district of Ballarat, East and West, the Irish-born population was 13.5%, Roman Catholics 17.5%. Peter Lawler first represented the community here in 1855, later becoming Speaker of the House and Assembly member until 1887. In 1861, in Kilmore, now a Melbourne suburb, where the Victorian Legislative Assembly member was John O'Shaughnessy, born in Banlahow, Thurles, future Premier of Victoria. He was the leader of the Irish community, where the Irish-born population was 33% and the Roman Catholic population over 50%. The family was of crucial importance in Irish rural society, not only as the primary building block of community and society, but also as the primary economic unit of production. Immigration did not demolish these familial bonds and traditions of obligation and community endeavour. Rather, as Campbell described in The Kingdom of the Rhymes, this immigration to Australia by Irish kindred groups often enhanced and reinforced their family ties. Immigration and family reunification was used as an economic strategy to further prospects and opportunities, especially for the next generation. As shown, the Borrisoleigh families, once torn asunder by famine and eviction, were reformed, restored thousands of miles away, where eventually new bonds and relationships were formed within and without their tribe. In this picture you can see the death notices of everybody who put in native of Borrisoleigh in their death notice in the Australian papers from late 1860s to the early 1930s. On this island, we have been part of the sender community for centuries. The future role of research in this field may be to continue this transnational exploration and reconnection of the Irish diasporic communities. As Ireland has now many attractive pull factors, this research may be essential in order that we may help and understand the new arriving communities so that positive and beneficial outcomes are realised. This work has been inspired by a passion to discover the stories of the past so that they might inform the concerns for the future. The study also highlights the need to continue embroidering the national historical narrative with more nuanced local histories. The end.
Magazine, the diaspora, the people who emigrated, the carers particularly, who emigrated to Australia. And of course, he picked it up and he got my number, and since then we have communicated a lot, and a lot of what he has told you tonight, I didn't know anything about that about 15 years ago. I was in Australia, and I just want to give you just for a few moments to tell you what can happen by sheer coincidence and luck. And I was there visiting my cousin at the Hartys, Michael Harty, or Patrick Harty and Philip. I forgot to mention that I'm a direct connection of Catherine Harty, as mentioned. She was my great-grandaunt, I think, or thereabouts.
Oh, great again.
And as Jamie said, she married a guy called Philip Cairns. I had never in my life heard of the Cairns family at all, not even from my mother, who was born up in Carrigean and lived there with her brothers and sisters. So off I find myself in Australia, and I'm down in Adelaide with Philip Harty, who's still hailing Harty there, and he said, "Did you ever hear of the Cairns family from Borrisoleigh?" I said, "Not at all, I don't know who they are." And I probably said, "I don't care either." So anyway, he produces a bundle of letters. actual letters written by the St. Patrick Cairns that you referred to, this man who was a young boy who went out with Philip Cairns, who died, and he and Catherine went on, and he became very wealthy. And so I wondered why these letters were written to my mother, actually. My mother's name was Delia Harty, and it was dear Delia, and also to another Michael Harty as well, her brother. So that was fascinating, and I said, what can we do with these and how can I verify them? So, as you mentioned, they lived in Waverley in Sydney. That was the really posh part of Sydney. So he must have had loads and loads of money to even get there, which he did. He made all his money up in where it was, Maringo, wasn't it, Jim?
Maringo.
Yeah, Maringo. And then, so looking through these, we found one letter, I still have the copy of it, 1924, 100 years ago. This young boy, Patrick Cairns, had written to my mother, enclosing £5 and hoping that it would make your Easter more comfortable. Those kind of words, you know. So I said, this is fascinating stuff altogether. And I subsequently found out that the Harty family, as far as I can recall, Jeremy, you might recommend that they actually gave money to the Cairns to emigrate.
Yeah.
And now that he had made a lot of money, it was his time to pay back. And that money, along with other letters with money, obviously helped to educate my mother and brothers and sisters and all that kind of carry on. So I have a lot to be thankful for to the Cairns in many ways. But what do we do with these letters? So I said, there were no mobile phones or anything like that at that time, and I had no email addresses for anybody. So we looked up the telephone directory for Sydney, and with the name like Cairns, and with an address like Waverley, the very first name that I saw was Cairns, M. Cairns. And I rang that number out of the blue, 1,000 miles away, and a lovely lady, a young woman of about 30, she answered, and she was one of them, one of the Cairns, yeah. She was a lawyer, and my brother was with me, and we met her a couple of days later in Sydney, and she arrived with loads and loads of photographs and documents of every kind, and she gave me loads and loads of information. So that's exactly how this coincidence of this Cairns, that you probably knew quite a bit about the Cairns at that time. I didn't anyway.
No, I didn't.
Either. So that was the link. But the important thing about the Cairns is that I've been there several times since, and I've met lots of them, and they're very prolific, to say the very least, and they're all over the place, and they're very nice people indeed. Some of them have come here to do some research before I ever knew about them at all. But the sad part was, of course, that Patrick Cairns, Philip Cairns, died as a young man and was left on the side of the road, as Jimmy referred to, and they went back several times and could never find him. So that was a very sad part. So one of his descendants had written a lovely poem about the whole thing, but unfortunately I haven't got it with me tonight, which was very, very nice. So all I want to say is thank you very much to Jeremy for including all about the Harties in this lot. And I'm sure there's a lot of people here. I don't know if Nora is here tonight. Is she Nora Zellini? Nora Harty? Is it not? No, she's my cousin. I said, not there, yeah. Okay, yeah. So there you are. Anyway, thank you very much indeed, and all the very best to Jeremy in the future for his further research. Yeah. Bye-bye.
If anyone has a question, or we can just go straight to tea.
Just want to congratulate you, Jane, and lovely talk. More than that, you know, for judicial study, for bringing that talk. know. And it just shows that no story is complete, you know. No story is comprehensive or complete. There's a lot of that which we find out that extra to go. And I was thinking, when I came across this first one, the most tragic things I ever read, you know, and I always try to separate emotion from history. But when you read the reports in the Nation and the Freeman's Journal of the Cullohill evictions, you can't dispense with the emotion. Not one of the harrowing reports that I think I've ever read about any of that period, in any paper. You know, it's a great, like, you know, it was forgotten. Because thanks to the Freeman's Journal, I suppose, it has been remembered. The Nation newspaper, only for that we documented. And I think those reports in the Secretary of the Taylor was limited recall.
Yeah.
So we owe those people dead, like, you know, who today would know about that?
Well,
you know, but now to remember it. And I suppose the challenge for us, Jane, is like, it wasn't the only tragedy. This is on our communities, say, back in famine times, you know, to research these things further. You know, I think that's the challenge to it, to research these things further, to give these people their memory, their dignity, you know, to connect with the present. And like the way you finished up there, Jane, you know, it offers us a bigger challenge, you know, like the hundreds of thousands of people that left our shore, you know, the hundreds that left our parish here. And I suppose basically employ themselves in other communities, you know, and we see a reversal of that today, and, you know, and how do we deal with these things? You know, thank God, when our people went, they were given the opportunity to prosper, you know, so I think that's important. But then another challenge is, Jamie, what's the next step we do with all of this? You know, to remember, you know, our parliament. Thanks, Jamie.
thanks, John. Tea is poured.